Speaker. I don't put words in your mouth. But
I concur absolutely what the President said. It's a clear violation of the Geneva provisions for the protection of prisoners of war, and it will have very, very strong repercussions not only throughout the United States but throughout the world if these violations continue.
Mr. President,
no, I can't do a press conference. I do want to say something, though, about the Baltic states. I am increasingly concerned. We had a statement on that yesterday. I would again appeal to the Soviet Union leaders to resist using force. And we've heard the European countries speaking out on this now, and the world is very much concerned about that as well. So thank you all very much.
Will he be held accountable, Mr. President? Will he be held accountable?
You can count on it. You can count on it.
Is that what you got it, sir? You can count on it?
This is big.
I thought the real headline today was that general briefing in Seattle should keep the faith. Now you got it mad, right?
We are back with the phone lines open. You're looking at the south lawn of the White House. The President has just landed from Camp David with Speaker of the House Tom Foley. Took a few questions with the press corps assembled there. The primary subject was the treatment of prisoners of war by the Iraqis, American prisoners of war, coalition prisoners of war. And we continue to look for your opinions, your reactions to the events of the Gulf War. And saw, Mr. Feith.
I think that the United States is necessarily going to have to carry some of its war aims a bit beyond what was announced at the beginning of the operation. The liberation of Kuwait is one issue, but prosecuting the Iraqi political and military leadership for war crimes is another one, and I think that the emphasis now that the President made reinforces what the British Prime Minister made a few hours ago on the importance of holding the Iraqi leadership accountable legally for its aggressions and its mistreatment of prisoners of war and the like.
I am intrigued by the title of your past position of Deputy Assistant Secretary for Negotiations Policy, and in the context of a lot of the comments our audience is making or are making about how we got into this situation. What do you say to the proposition that there was never an opportunity for a settlement because President Bush didn't allow Saddam Hussein any place to go in terms of negotiations, that it was all or nothing? Is that a fair criticism of the American approach to the Iraqis?
It's a criticism only if you believe that principle has nothing to do with it. The United States insisted from the beginning that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait, and that an aggression by Iraq against a peaceful, essentially defenseless neighbor could not stand and was a violation of international law and had to be reversed. There's no compromise available between saying aggression will not be rewarded and aggression will be rewarded. There was nothing really to negotiate about as far as the basic position that the United Nations took on the evacuation of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. So I don't think it's a fair criticism of the U.S. administration to say we didn't give Iraq some face-saving way out, because that's another way of saying we didn't give Iraq a chance for some reward for its aggression. And we shouldn't have given Iraq any chance for any reward for its aggression.
Is it a fair comparison to make that President Kennedy's negotiation in the Cuban Missile Crisis did offer such an out and averted a world crisis, and this situation did not? And what differences do you see between the two situations?
Well, one would have to get into a lengthy historical discussion, but I think that the cases are very distinguishable. one of the points that I think is very interesting is that no leader on the world stage since Adolf Hitler has so clearly demonstrated to Americans the limits of diplomacy as Saddam has. And it's something of an article of faith among Americans that all international problems have diplomatic resolutions. And I think we've come to see in the case of Saddam that there are some people in the world that are not interested in compromise. They're not interested in splitting the difference. They pursue aggressive policies violently and brutally, and the only way they can be dealt with is to stop them militarily. And I think it's an important lesson that the world is not always full of people who want to behave moderately and play by the rules, and with whom you can negotiate compromises.
Phone lines are open. We'll go to the phones in just a moment as we talk with Douglas Feith. As we said, used to be Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Negotiations Policy. He also served as special counsel to Richard Pearl when Richard Pearl was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. Mr. Feith also worked for the National Security Council in the White House, where he was a Middle East specialist. You may have seen his byline in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and other places. He's currently an attorney in private practice in Washington, D.C.?
Yes.
And the nature of your practice is?
It's largely a business law practice.
All right. Altus, Oklahoma is first up with Douglas Feith. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, Mr. Feith, I'd like for you to explain what President Bush is talking about, the New World Order. Could you explain that to us?
I think that topic the term is a little bit vague, and it's unclear to me exactly what the president has in mind. I would think that part of what he has in mind is to increase somewhat the role that law plays in governing the relations among nations. There are certain rules that are recognized by some countries for the way states should behave. And if we can expand the community of nations that operates according to those rules, you could have a more peaceful world. It has to be recognized at the same time, as I mentioned before about Saddam Hussein, that not every ruler in the world, not every important actor in the world is going to allow himself to be governed by rules. And so it's like a domestic community. You maximize the role that law plays in regulating the behavior of people within your domestic community, but at the same time you have your police to deal with those people who refuse to play by the rules.
What is negotiations policy in terms of your job title?
Well, at the Pentagon, my responsibilities covered a number of mostly multilateral arms control negotiations, the conventional force reduction talks in Vienna, the Stockholm Conference on Disarmament in Europe, the chemical weapons negotiations in Geneva, and East-West political relations.
When you came to work each morning in those years, what was your overall objective?
Well, it was helping to formulate U.S. policy in those various arms control negotiations primarily. I also had responsibility for nuclear non-proliferation policy. And,
but does that mean deciding what position to take as you go into a negotiation and then what the fallback might be, that kind of policy making?
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Then the title describes pretty well what you were doing. Austin, Texas, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to comment on what's been a great topic of discussion today is the nature of the media coverage coming out of the Gulf. And a lot of people complaining about, what they consider to be sensitive coverage, and you shouldn't upset people at home and show them this. And I think the Pentagon is aware of that because they're censoring it very carefully. I think they're aware that if people really see what war is, we have the technology now, we can be there, witness it live. When people see the killing and they see what's happening, they will demand a negotiated settlement. And I don't accept that Saddam wasn't willing to negotiate. I think he wasn't willing to completely surrender his position, and neither was George Bush. You know, I think that there could definitely have been a negotiated solution if this deadline hadn't been set. And I mean, it's all just, you know, like face saving. But the other point about the coverage is people complaining about the media coverage of demonstrators. Well, I've taken part in several demonstrations. And there were quite a few people there, and we represent a segment of the people in this country. This is our opinion. We deserve to be seen.
All right, caller, let me ask you before we go on to the next call. You still believe, do you not, that there could have been a negotiated settlement?
Oh, definitely. Well, I think the crisis goes back far before, because Saddam Hussein tried negotiation for over a year with Kuwait. And
But Douglas Feith, whose job it was in the Pentagon at one time to make policy for negotiation, says that there was no room for negotiation. What do you think about that?
Well, I think in light of our objectives, there was no room, because we do not want to concede. But it's obvious to me, when this crisis first broke, I went to my map on the wall and said, Kuwait is a part of Iraq. You know, and then went to my history book and said, the English, you know, the British and Americans took it away to set up, to control the Gulf, to control this rich oil region. It goes back a long way, and I think it's just a result of a warped foreign policy, and it's also kind of a failure of this so-called peace through strength policy. If peace through strength worked, after 10 years of spending $300 billion plus a year, why are we in war?
All right,
worked.
Thank you. What do you think of that, Douglas Feith?
I think that it's a little bit like somebody suggesting that you deal with a bank robbery problem when the robber is in the bank and holding people hostage by saying, well, how about if we offer the guy just a little bit of money to make him go away instead of you know, not giving in to his demands and saying, you're going to get no money and we're going to catch you. Saddam Hussein stole Kuwait. We could have taken the position that we'll give him a piece of Kuwait to buy him off, but that would not have done anything to bring peace or security to the Gulf, and would have been a terrible abdication of responsibility on the part of the United States and the world community. It would have clearly encouraged Saddam to use whatever resources he could steal from Kuwait to build up his military power to launch future aggressions. The risk of that was just much too great to justify any kind of U.S. effort to compromise with them. As for what the caller said about Kuwait belonging to Iraq, I would have to beg to differ as a lawyer and as a student of history. I think that it's quite clear that Iraq's claims to have owned Kuwait have no valid legal or historical background. The al-Sabah family has been running Kuwait since the middle part of the 18th century, and there was never a valid Iraqi claim to Kuwait.
Lacey Washington is next. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Feith.
Yes?
I'm a Vietnam vet. I was a helicopter door gunner. I was shot down twice. I'm still in the Army, and I could go any time. I'm up here at Fort Lewis. I'd like to make 4 points. The second point I'd like to make is these people that are demonstrating are sending the wrong signal to the troops. And I know this from experience. And as far as I'm concerned, they are vacuum packed.
What do you mean by that?
The reason I say that is because they don't understand, as you have so eloquently put it, that other governments don't think like we do. A good example is Saddam Hussein.
Caller, your second point?
Okay. The other reason I think we should be there is because I don't want to see my grandson in 15 years fighting in a nuclear environment.
Third point?
Third point, for those who have fought for it, freedom has a taste the protected will never know. And also, I firmly believe in 15 years, these demonstrators won't have anything to demonstrate about, because the people of New York just might get a surprise from Hussein.
Meaning?
Meaning possibly a nuclear attack.
From Iraq?
Roger that.
All right, sir, thank you. Douglas Feith, any comment?
I think the caller has highlighted what really is a major part of the strategic essence of this crisis. That is the danger that if we had not stopped Hussein now, we would find ourselves facing him 5 or 10 years from now, when he will have been stronger, having made use of the fruits of his aggression against Kuwait and possibly other aggressions, and also may have by that time developed nuclear weapons. That's a very serious problem. The point that he made about being subject to a nuclear attack on New York raises the very interesting question of ballistic missile defense. It's worth noting that many of the people who were advocating the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 80s called attention to the utility of strategic defense with reference to countries around the world that could develop ballistic missile capabilities, not merely the utility against the Soviet Union. We warned that missile technologies are proliferating, nuclear weapons technology is proliferating around the world, and there is the danger of crazy states acquiring nuclear weapons capabilities and the long-range delivery means for them. And it's clear that having some capability to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles is going to be of great value, not simply with respect to the Soviet Union, but with respect to these kinds of capabilities that over coming decades we think have a pretty good chance of spreading.
Durham, North Carolina, you're on the air.
Good afternoon. I have 2 comments to make. Number one, judging by what Mr. Feith just said, obviously we need a world supervising agency to control nuclear proliferation. That's been in the works for a long time, and we have got a test ban treaty with the Soviet Union. I agree with the woman who spoke before that these things have to be negotiated. But I have a more specific question in light of President Bush's comments about the prisoners of war. There are 2 alternatives. They've been induced to say what they've said, either through brainwashing or torture, which would not surprise me. But the other alternative is that perhaps they really do believe what they said. I recall the My Lai incident and the Nuremberg decisions, giving responsibility to the individual military person to be responsible for his or her actions. And I wonder if indeed the second alternative is true and that these flyers do believe that the war is unjust, etc., that we are missing a good bet with our prisoners of war, the Iraqi prisoners of war. Perhaps they have some sentiments to voice about Saddam Hussein's treatment, dictatorial powers, etc., and why aren't we doing the same thing? Would this violate the Geneva Convention? In my time, it was name, rank, and serial number. Apparently, they can now give their age. But if indeed this represents their true feelings, are they permitted to air them publicly? And if so, why don't we go after the Iraqi prisoners of war to do the same thing?
Thank you. Durham, North Carolina.
I think it's very morally repugnant for the Iraqis to be exploiting the American POWs, and the basic rules for how to deal with POWs are laid out in the Geneva Conventions. It's generally been recognized that it's in everybody's interest in a war to comply with those conventions, and exploiting the POWs for propaganda purposes and using them as human shields is a war crime, as the President has pointed out. And I don't see any point in rewarding Saddam for that by taking too seriously the statements that were made by these very unfortunate pilots that were shot down.
If the prisoners of war that the coalition has taken want to voluntarily express their negative opinions of Saddam Hussein, would it be a violation of the convention for the coalition to permit such public statements to be made?
To permit the Iraqis, if they would want to voluntarily do it, it might not violate the convention to permit them to do it voluntarily, but it would seem to be pretty ill-advised, given that the Iraqis would undoubtedly say that that justifies their extracting statements from the U.S. and British and other POWs that they have.
But in terms of the technical law or convention, voluntary statements are permitted by POWs.
That's probably right.
Okay. Next. Harvey, Louisiana is next. Go ahead.
I'd just like to, for one, commend C-SPAN for the good programming that they've brought us over the years, and it's a great show. Secondly, I'd like to say that I am very surprised about the misinformation that they had down at Congress at the time when they were debating the issue of whether we should go to war or not. I noticed that one young lady, she was a representative, and I forgot what state it was from, but she commented that there's no way in this world we should send troops over to Saudi Arabia to protect the Saudi government and to reinstall the sheikhdom of Kuwait because they discriminated against women and whatnot. I think that's a very ethnocentric view of things. Granted, the people in the Middle East whose laws are based on the Quran, and the Quran pretty much dictates how the interrelationships of people are going to go. Secondly, I like to say that I don't disagree with the protest. I don't have any problem with the protest, being a member of the military myself. However, they have a gentleman who organized a lot of the protests, and especially the protests in front of the White House. He runs the Family Support Network, and I'd just like to tell him that his son would probably be better off if he supported the troops more than he wanted to protest. Because if I were out in the front line, and I don't know when I'm going to be called up, I'm pretty sure we will be. If I were out in the front line, it would reduce my morale to have my father protesting in front of the White House. And even if it didn't reduce my morale, it might reduce the morale of the people around me. And if that's the case, it's more likely that I'm going to come back in a body bag than if their morale was high and they fought to the best of their capabilities.
Thank you. Harvey? Douglas Feith?
I think that we have to recognize that whether we agree or disagree with the protesters have a right to be out demonstrating. The U.S. Constitution gives Americans the right to be wrong.
I want to take you back through last year and ask you what perspective you had given your former position dealing with negotiations, and then you're out in the real world, the private sector. But you saw all this playing out over the last year. What were your thoughts as you saw the different positionings, the positions of, let's call it the now coalition, and then Saddam Hussein hardening toward August the 2nd?
The United States was working hard in the months preceding the August invasion of Kuwait to improve relations with Saddam Hussein on the assumption that Saddam was a sensible, basically moderate guy with whom we could do business. Some of us were very skeptical of that policy and critical of that policy even before Saddam moved into Kuwait. There are a lot of illusions in the United States, and in particular in the circles of Middle East specialists, about the fundamental views that the various Arab leaders have toward the United States, people like Saddam Hussein, people like Yasser Arafat. I think there are a lot of illusions that many of these people are fundamentally inclined to be friendly with the United States if we could only remove one or two small irritants in our relationship with them, like Israel. And I think that greater understanding needs to be developed here, that a lot of the objections that people like Saddam Hussein, Yasser Arafat, and others in the Middle East have to the United States are very profound, and they're cultural, and it reflects a deep anti-Western sentiment on their part, which is reflected in many of the demonstrations that we see, the mass demonstrations in Jordan and elsewhere. And these people object to Israel, I think it's fair to say, more because Israel is a Western country than Israel is a Jewish country. And we need to not mix up cause and effect here. I don't think it is the case that people like Saddam are people with whom we can do business, nor do I think people like Assad or Arafat are people that we can do business with if we would only press Israel to cut a deal with them. These are people who are fundamentally, profoundly antagonistic to Western values, Western democratic institutions, and Western interests.
So last year, as you were watching the two parties move into position, was it inevitable that we wound up where we are, or was there ever an opportunity to finesse it?
Well, everything looks inevitable in retrospect. I think that Saddam might have hesitated in going into Kuwait. I think he would have hesitated in going into Kuwait if we had given him a strong signal that we were going to meet that aggression with the kind of response that we in fact mustered against him. We gave him the opposite signal, and the now notorious interview between Saddam Hussein and the U.S. ambassador to Iraq that occurred a few weeks before the invasion in August demonstrates that we were signaling to Saddam that we viewed Iraq's problems with Kuwait as an internal Arab affair, and that we were unlikely to respond strongly if he should make a move against Kuwait. I think what that reflected is the standard view of our State Department bureaucracy in not making sharp threats. And so we made a mild statement that Saddam misread as American indifference to whether Saddam moves against Kuwait. When he moved, the president responded in a very bold, tough manner, and I'm sure Saddam was shocked that the United States took the strong position that President Bush did in the days following the invasion, because I think he had a clear impression that we wouldn't take that kind of position based on what he had been told by our diplomats beforehand.
Kotati, California is next. Go ahead.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to make a couple of quick points. After I hang up, I'd appreciate it if you have a number to call the White House directly to register our opinions there. I'd appreciate your broadcasting that. Several of the viewers, or the callers earlier, talked about stopping Iraq's nuclear weapons development. And I'd like to point out that Israel stopped their nuclear weapons development in the past, or at least slowed it down significantly, without spending 5 days and 7,000 sorties. I believe that we have intercontinental ballistic missiles that are supposed to be accurate within 40 or 50 feet, and we could put a really big warhead on one of those and probably knock out a nuclear weapons development facility. Now, I did have a question for the expert, and that was that when we initially started going over into Saudi Arabia, it seems to me that Bush said the sanctions would take a year before we would know whether or not they were taking effect. And we didn't wait a year. We waited something around 5 or 6 months. Would you like to comment on that?
I think that the problem with the sanctions was twofold. Number one, they would not have taken, they would not have squeezed Saddam sufficiently to have given us a reasonable chance of having him withdraw from Kuwait in a reasonable period of time, a period of time where we could have felt confident that the international coalition would hold. The second problem with them is that they would, even if they had squeezed Saddam with respect to Kuwait eventually, they would have done nothing to address the question of Iraq's capability to launch aggressions in the future. And what we have accomplished so far in the first several thousand sorties against Iraq is a major reduction in Iraq's ability to launch aggressions. So there's tremendous inherent value, even though we haven't yet gotten Iraq out of Kuwait, there's tremendous value inherent in the damage that has already been done to Iraq's military machine.
The caller asked for the White House phone number, and that phone number is area code 202-456-1414. And we might even be able to put it up on the screen, but that's the number that is the most widely distributed, the number, I think that's the number that's used by everybody when they call to express their opinions on any national or international issue, and the one that the staff totes up and releases to the public. 202-456-1414. Is that your experience? I mean, you've been in the administration. Does a call to the White House, is it registered? Does it make any difference in terms of the administration's policy?
All politicians count the mail, and they count the phone calls. My experience is that the counting tends to be very simple, tends to be binary. Elegant messages delivered with great complexity and sophistication to a political office are not likely to be credited for the full sophistication of the message. But calculations about this guy's for us, this guy's against us are made, and politicians pay very close attention. The political offices within the White House, the offices on Capitol Hill, pay very close attention to the kind of public responses they get to whatever they're doing.
Well, if you want to do it, it's 202-456-1414. I haven't heard any counts so far. Maybe they've been too busy to do that sort of thing, or maybe the private polling organizations are doing quite enough of it. But the caller asked for it, that's the number. And the next call for Douglas Feith, who used to work in the Pentagon on negotiations policy. This call from Ocean City, New Jersey. Go ahead.
Hello. I'm calling specifically about the POWs. I'm wondering if the White House has been looking into specialists on thought reform. I'm thinking particularly, excuse me, of Robert J. Lifton and Dr. Margaret Singer, who have studied this since the Korean POW incidents when they first came back from Korea and were making statements, had made statements on film denouncing the United States. Lifton wrote a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and both Lifton and Singer, who were involved with those guys, have since been studying the use of mind control techniques as used by dangerous cults, allegedly by groups like the Unification Church. And I'm an investigative reporter, and what I found in interviewing young people coming out of some of these groups is within 48 hours, they can take a person who may be hostile to the ideas of the group and turn them completely around without using torture, without using physically abusive techniques, but rather using psychological pressure. And I guess that's my first question. The second part is, I'm a Vietnam-era vet, and I'd like to remind people who are complaining about the protesters that the reason we fought there and the reason we fought in our wars is to allow people to have a difference of opinion and to express it freely. And we're all happy to see people protesting in the Soviet Union now, and I think that if we're going to rejoice at that, we also should rejoice that we're still able to do that here.
All right, sir, thank you. Ocean City, New Jersey, the general idea of how the Defense Department prepares personnel for capture.
Well, there's training. I mean, they have courses for pilots on what to expect if they get captured and how to behave.
Jacksonville, Florida is next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to say a couple of things. First of all, the educational system in America has produced an apathy, particularly among young Americans, such that reliance on official statements seems to be almost Orwellian, like his 1984 novel. Americans just don't explore the issues as they should before they render an opinion, and I think that that's something that we need to be concerned about. Second, Mr. Feith, I'd like to say something about your analogy with regard to police and rules in a society. It seems that we have selectively enforced police actions, particularly when you look at aggression or naked aggression in South Africa and in the Baltic states. I don't see troops camped out off the coast of the Soviet Union or in South Africa or in other areas of the world where there seems to be some type of naked aggression. And thirdly, this coalition that we've built includes among its numbers people that I don't think that the American people would find very tasteful, such as Hafez al-Assad. He's been to the White House and has been the president has courted his support. And if people were to examine the kinds of things that he's been responsible for throughout the world, then I think that they would see him as see Saddam Hussein as the candy man as compared to this guy, and that we're in bed with at this point. And I just like to hear your comments on that, Mr. Feith.
I think that there is a selective enforcement problem, and U.S. policy benefits when there is a greater principle, and when the principles that we're operating on are easy for people to understand and clearly stated. And the U.S. government doesn't always operate that way, and is not always terribly articulate in the way it elucidates the principles that it's operating on, and it sometimes operates in ways that violate basic principles. It certainly would help if, the basic point is that it would certainly help if there were greater respect for basic principles of international order, like respect for the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of countries. These basic principles of international law generally work very well among countries that are law-abiding. I mean, U.S. relations with Canada, U.S. relations with our European allies are governed by basic principles of international law. If we can expand the community that operates according to those rules and strengthen the rules and strengthen enforcement of treaty obligations, the world will be a better place. It'll be safer. It'll be generally more peaceful. I think that part of what the United States is doing in this operation against Iraq is to promote those principles. There are elements, as the gentleman pointed out, that cut the other way, and I think that our coalition, the inclusion in the coalition of Hafez al-Assad of Syria, cuts the other way. I agree that it undermines the principles that we're trying to defend to get in bed with a guy like Hafez al-Assad. But things are not always completely neat, clean, rigorous, and logical in international affairs, and this is an example of that.
We'll spend several more minutes with Douglas Feith, continuing to take your calls. Then we're going to show you an interview that we did with Mr. Philip Congdon. He's over in Dhahran. We conducted an interview with him this morning, and we'll show you that if you missed it. And then we'll be back to keep the phones open throughout the afternoon. We might even be over at the Pentagon, where you can talk to some of the people over there. But the point is that when the House is not in session, we will have the opportunity for you to voice your own point of view about the events in the Gulf. And the next call for our guest, Douglas Feith, is from Ellensburg, Washington. Go ahead.
Hi, I have many comments I'd like to make. I know there's probably not enough time to make them all. The first comment I'd like to make is I do support the troops 100%. I do believe that we should be over there. I don't believe that we should be letting Hussein do what he's doing. I have a comment about the anti-war protesters. I do believe they have a right to do what they're doing. However, I don't support what they are doing. I think that it could reduce the morale of the troops. However, I do think that they do know that more of us support them than not. I think back to the Vietnam War. I was a teenager. I don't remember that much about it. I remember the anti-war protest, and I I think that if I had been old enough, I probably would have been right in there with them, because I don't believe that that was a war we should have been in. This one, I do believe we should be there. And as far as the POWs go, I wonder if this is going to be like it was in the Vietnam War, where when the war is over, we don't get our POWs back. And the question that I'd like to pose is, what are we going to do if he does not give them back?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I'm sure that the U.S. government is going to do everything that it can to, first of all, ensure that the POWs are treated properly, and secondly, that we get them back, and thirdly, that the people who would be responsible for any mistreatment of our POWs get caught and punished.
Omaha, Nebraska is next. Go ahead.
Yes, a couple of questions, actually, and a couple of point of views. Number one, I'm 20 years old, and it's kind of strange for a person as young as I am to have very many views as far as this is concerned. However, one thing I'd like to know is what kind of legal ramifications are open in which to prosecute Hussein as far as the war crimes that have happened or that are going on right now. And there's a lot of other things that I disagree with and a lot of things that I agree with. A lady made a comment earlier saying that Kuwait belonged to Iraq. Well, you could always sit there and go back a little farther and take a look and say that Iraq belonged to Turkey, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. I believe what we are doing is right as far as the military going in there, because if it didn't happen, then eventually probably would have turned out like Hitler, where he took over one country, nobody stopped him. He took over another country, nobody stopped him, took over another country, nobody stopped him, and then finally he did the one that broke the camel's back. And we're stopping another Hitler now in the early stages while we can stop him. I'd like to know what your views are and how or what the legal ramifications are and what can be done to Hussein or the military government as far as the war crimes are.
Thank you, Omaha.
There are a number of international agreements that Saddam has violated for which he could be prosecuted legally. The aggression against Kuwait violates the UN Charter, the most important provision of the UN Charter, against the threat or the use of force against other countries. His attacks on Israel are also a violation of that same provision, and they violate the laws of war in that they were attacks that were purposefully directed at civilian targets, which is not a lawful act of belligerency. Any mistreatment of POWs would violate the Geneva Conventions. His earlier mistreatment of diplomats also violates international conventions. If we go back before the current crisis, his use of chemical weapons against Iran violated Iraq's obligations under the 1925 Geneva Conventions. I mean, what this demonstrates is that law doesn't mean a whole lot to Saddam Hussein. He is not a guy who is going to be constrained by treaties. And I think that it's important for us to focus not only on Saddam's illegalities, but on the attitudes throughout his region to the violation of those international agreements. It's interesting how much general support there has been throughout the region for some of his worst crimes. The attacks on Israel, for example, both the New York Times and the Washington Post today have articles on the delight that his attacks on civilians in Tel Aviv have been met with in the Palestinian Arab community in the territories. this is an extremely troubling, these are extremely troubling reports, because they make us think that the hopes for a diplomatic resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict when this conflict is